Hi there, it's Matt here, and welcome back to the podcast. Welcome back to another AMA episode, Ask Me Anything episode. I am, as ever, joined by my spectacular colleague at the Center for Human Sleep Science here at UC Berkeley. That is Dr. Eti Ben Simon, the exceptional, the wonderfully unorthodox in her brilliance of science, but her truly first-rate, good-natured, marvelous personality. Welcome back to the show, Eti.
Hi, everyone. Great to be here.
Okay, so let's get straight to it. So on to the first of hopefully several questions. What do we have?
One of my favorite topics in sleep, lucid dreaming. People are interested in lucid dreaming and its scientific aspects.
It always comes up, doesn't it? As I'm sure you've been asked this when people say, "Oh, what do you do?" and you say, "I'm a sleep scientist." It's usually one of two things that emerges. First, it's the fact that they or their partner, they're not sleeping well, and please help me. That's the first. And then
I'm your subject.
And yes, yeah, I trust. You hear that so much. I could be your perfect subject. I just do not sleep. And then the second, if it's not that, it's usually into the world of dreaming. Lucid dreaming, what is it? Lucid dreaming, lay defined, is dreaming in which you start to control what it is you're doing. But scientifically, our definition is a little bit more loose. It's simply that you become aware of the fact that you're dreaming as you are dreaming. But most lucid dreaming, in terms of how we think about it and how it's studied scientifically, is that not only are you aware that you're dreaming as you are dreaming, but you can start to decide what it is that you wish to do. Those claims, if you think about it, you're an individual who says, I'm a lucid sleeper and I can do whatever it is I like when I am dreaming. How do you prove that scientifically? Because the individual is still asleep and they're still immobile. They can't move because they're in REM sleep, which is principally where lucid dreaming occurs. So you can't communicate with them. You can't get validation from them. Well, it turns out that we've developed clever methods to communicate with lucid dreamers and have them communicate to us. I told you that the body is paralyzed during sleep, and it is, with the exception of those eye movements. So your eyes still dart back and forward. Lucid dreamers can therefore use their eyes, and it's the eye movement activity that we're measuring in the sleep lab, to essentially create a form of Morse code communication to the sleep researchers. And we can see, based on their eye movements that we're recording, what they're telling us. So, for example, we could predefine with a lucid dreamer, tell me at the moment when you become lucid in your dream, because they have to go into dream sleep and then they develop lucidity. At that moment, do 3 very slow rolling eye movements to the left side. Okay, at that moment, we see them and we say, that's a very unusual pattern. It would only happen if they're telling us that they have now become lucid. And then we'll say, now stop moving your right hand. And when you're about to do that in your dream, do 3 upward flicks of your eyes. And then when you're moving your left hand, do 3 downward flicks of your eyes. So we can use this Morse code for them to tell us what they're doing. And some of the earliest studies that demonstrated this explicitly were studies where the lucid dreamers said, I've gained lucid control. And these were studies in males. And then they said, I'm going to engage in sexual activity and I'm going to bring myself to orgasm in the next few minutes. And of course, with a male following completion of an orgasm, there is a very definitive outcome that you can measure. And that's what they were doing in those early studies.
I thought my studies are interesting.
I know, exactly. But we thought that, measuring memory or memories being replayed at night was, no, come on, this is the type of stuff that, no wonder some of our articles never really get picked up by the press when we're competing with individuals bringing themselves to orgasm through lucid dreaming. But there've been some fantastic studies very much like this. There have been now studies inside of the MRI scanner, and people were saying, okay, now I am moving my right hand and now I am moving my left hand, because you're telling the experimenters with your eye movements inside of the brain scanner as you are sleeping. And sure enough, when we look at the brain scans, the part of the brain that controls their right hand was moving right at the time that they said that they were moving in their dream, even though inside of the MRI scanner, they're not moving at all. Why? Because they're paralyzed. But in the dream, they were moving their right hand. And when we looked at the brain scans, it clearly validated their claim that there was right hand movement activity in the brain. And when they were moving their left hand, there was left hand movement activity in the brain. So it was the first scientific validation that what lucid dreamers claimed that they could do actually seemed to be objectively true versus their subjective claim of being able to do it. How does it occur? We have some interesting hypotheses, but in truth, I don't think we still really understand what changes in your brain as you become lucid. Some years ago, there were a collection of studies that argued that your prefrontal cortex that sits right above your eyes, which is the part of the brain that is largely shut down as we go into dream sleep, that part of the brain reemerges in its activity when we become lucid. Why is that relevant? It's relevant because your prefrontal cortex is the part of your brain that is involved in rational, logical decision making and thought processes. And when we go into dream sleep, when we are not lucid, that part of the brain gets taken offline, and therefore we become irrational and we don't get to control what we're doing in our dreams. We suffer non-volitional removal of our typical choice of what we want to do. But that part of the brain, it was claimed by some evidence, comes back online when people become lucid. And therefore, they were suggesting that it's the prefrontal cortex that is the hub of control where you become lucid and therefore start to decide what you want to do, rather than you simply have to go along for the ride at the whimsy of whatever your REM sleep brain is deciding that you are going to dream. But then there's been pushback. There has been a suggestion that when you do some additional controlling of some artifacts in the data, that prefrontal cortex theory of lucid dreaming seems to go away. Oh, let me come on to potential techniques if you want to start lucid dreaming or increase the frequency with which you want to start lucid dreaming. But I should also mention a little bit of data regarding should you start trying to lucid dream and if there are any dangers. But the two techniques that are principally out there for trying to start to lucid dream or increase it are something called the MILD technique, MILD, and it stands for the mnemonic induction of lucid dreaming, MILD, mnemonic meaning memory. And the second one is something called the reality testing method. The mnemonic induction of lucid dreaming method is rather simple. It's that before you go to sleep, you remind yourself over and over again, I am going to remember my dreams. And I'm going to remember not just that I am dreaming, but that I can control my dreams. And you say that over and over and over again. And sure enough, when you do that, by way of reminding yourself, and that's the first part of the name, the mnemonic, the memory part of the sentence, then you induce a higher probability of lucid dreaming, hence mnemonic induction of lucid dreaming. The second one is reality testing. And that was probably popularized in a wonderful movie called Waking Life by Richard Linklater, the director. A brilliant movie. Please watch it if you haven't. And this involves you testing the reality of your world. What do I mean? Right now, I could be here in front of my microphone and I can reach out and I can press against the wall in front of me. And the wall resists me because that's the law of physics in the waking world. And what I do, I go throughout my waking day, and you can set random alarms on your phone or your watch. And throughout the day, you keep testing reality. You can pick up a glass and you can feel that it's solid, or you can dip your fingers in water and you can sense that it's cold. You can do lots of reality testing of the world. by doing that, it increases the likelihood that when you are dreaming, you start to also incorporate reality testing. But what happens is that when you start to do reality testing in the dreamscape, when I press my hand against the wall, maybe my hand goes all the way through the wall. And at that point, I think, oh, hang on a second, I've just violated the reality of the physical laws of the world. I can't be awake. I must be in dream sleep. This episode is supported by the fine folks at the Washington Post. When it comes to news, and including my obsession, which is science and medicine and health, I rely on high-quality reporting outlets of real integrity. That's why I'm so happy to partner with them. And yes, for those of you who know, I am signed up to the For You newsletter. And it provides me with my own personalized roundup of stories every day based on my interests and my reading history. It's really fantastic. It is my trusted news source. And if you are a listener to this show, you can now get the Washington Post at a fraction of the normal price. If you go to washingtonpost.com/Matt Walker, you will be able to get the Washington Post for an entire year for just 50 cents per week. Yep, 50 cents per week. I have no idea why they have done this for me. It makes no financial sense for them whatsoever. Again, just go over to washingtonpost.com/Matt Walker and you will get the Washington Post for 50 cents a week for an entire year. So again, washingtonpost.com/Matt Walker.
Can I share my reality check?
Yeah, what do you do? Lights on and off? Or?
I look at the clock on my wrist. I look away. I turn my wrist and then I look again. And usually in reality, I would see the same time. But I did it enough times. I started doing it in dreams. And then the second time you look, it's a completely different time. And sometimes the time doesn't even make sense. It would be like 36:17, or it would have letters on it. And you're like, oh, wow, I'm in a dream. And that was an amazing experience.
That's so genius. Yeah, the one that for a time I was trying to do some lucid dreaming, and I'm not a natural lucid dreamer. I'll come on to just population stats in a second, but I would do the light switch test. So I would go over to the wall and I would turn the light on, turn it off, turn it on, turn it off. And sure enough, when I only happened to do it twice when I was dreaming. And one of those two times when I switched nothing happened. The light was not working. And I thought, I know what's happening here. This light normally works. And I know it works because every day I switch that light on. But now it's not working. Something wacky is, I must be dreaming. And then I actually had a wonderful snowboarding dream where I was going off these jumps and I was Olympic level trick snowboarder. And it was the most sublime feeling. And then when I woke up, I was so sad that I had zero snowboarding capacity. I should come on to some population stats just to close it out. If you look at the general population, only about 20-ish% of the population are natural lucid dreamers. So this comes on to the question, or one of the ways in which I think about the question of, should I lucid dream or not? And you could argue from one side of this evolutionary perspective, if lucid dreaming was so adaptive, so beneficial for us as a species to be doing, then that statistic should be reversed. At least 80% of us should be natural lucid dreamers if it confers such an evolutionary benefit. But it's really very much against that. The problem, to play devil's advocate with my logic, is that it assumes we've stopped evolving. And therefore, maybe the 20% of the population who are natural lucid dreamers are right at the very forefront of hominid evolution. And we shouldn't be worrying about AI and GPT, and we should be worrying about the 20% who are lucid dreamers, because they're the ones who are going to be the advanced species and are going to take over the world. But anyway, I digress. The only evidence, I would say, in truth, that is out there to argue maybe you want to think twice about trying to do lucid dreaming, and I think it's very weak evidence in terms of advocating against it. If you look at some of the studies where people have asked, after a night of lucid dreaming versus a night where you did not lucid dream, how restored and refreshed do you feel by your sleep? And on average, people typically say, when I had a night of lucid dreaming, I don't feel as restored, I don't feel as refreshed by my sleep. So you could argue maybe it's a less restorative form of sleep. But I think there was at least one study that argued that was not the case. So right now, I don't think there's any good evidence either way to argue strongly in favor of us all trying to do this or strongly against anyone trying to do this. Any thoughts on lucid dreaming, Eti?
Yeah, I agree. And anecdotally, I just want to add that I felt that the dream narrative sometimes like pushes back against me becoming lucid. So at one point, I was about to do the reality check with my watch, and I would lift my hand up, and suddenly I wouldn't have a hand. Uh, for some reason, that wasn't enough for my brain to realize that I'm dreaming. I was like, okay, I can do the test. I'll just carry on. But there is something about, I mean, we don't have enough studies on this yet, but from people I've talked to that are more experienced lucid dreamers, trying to control the dream is significantly harder than just becoming lucid. There's another step where you just completely take control over the narrative. That's something that takes more practice. So we can also ask whether just becoming lucid, but still viewing the same dream or kind of following the same line of story, is that okay, or is that different from just hijacking the dream altogether?
And that also leads to the question of what are the two underlying mechanisms there, because it would argue that perhaps becoming lucid is one change in your brain, and
Mhm.
then becoming lucid and starting to control what it is that you're doing must require some additional neurobiological step within your brain for it to be instigated and accomplished successfully. Because if that is truly the case, that there is some dichotomy there between those two things, just because you're lucid doesn't mean that you can start to control your dreams, then there must be an extra brain step in place that supports not just lucidity, but lucidity with defining control of your dreamscape.
Exactly. And I think also once we know more about the functions of dream altogether, it'll just be easier to answer the question of lucid dreaming.
And that does lead to a very interesting hypothesis, though, which is if we start to understand the functions of dreaming, rather than just simply using lucid dreaming whimsically to experience whatever it is that you wish for, let's say it's Olympic level X Games snowboarder, maybe what you could do is direct your dreams to other things. For example, let's say that you are going through a difficult emotional experience right now. Maybe you're going through a really hard time in terms of a breakup with your partner, or you're going through a transformational change professionally and it's a real struggle.
Mhm.
Maybe you can use the lucid process, because we know that sleep is very good at doing, and particularly dream sleep is very good at doing a form of overnight therapy for our brains, so that we come back feeling better. We gain emotional resolution to difficult challenges. We also know that dreaming is very good in terms of inspiring creativity. So could we start to harness the spotlight of lucid dreaming in more useful ways above and beyond simply improved entertainment at night, and therefore produce significant clinical outcome benefits? I think that's a very fascinating possibility
It
too, but we're
is.
very far from that.
It is. And I know that Eastern traditions like Buddhism, they actually use lucid dreaming in some of their practices. You are invited to have a conversation with yourself during a lucid dream, turn yourself into different animals or the other gender, and really through that learn more about what's troubling you and more about yourself.
I think many people listening will understand that when I dream, it seems to be somewhat, it has relationships with my life and my world, but then other time it just seems to be very random, almost just
Mhm.
completely illogical, and it makes no rhyme or reason. I would say though that for most people, however, the one thing that runs through from their waking life into their dreaming life, almost like a red thread narrative, are emotional concerns and emotional difficulties. And if there is any function to dreaming above and beyond REM sleep itself, I think one of those, based on the evidence, is very clearly emotional processing and trying to better resolve the emotional challenges. This comes back to the anxiety. I think if we have unresolved emotion that is too strong and we haven't done our work during the day to help manage that anxiety, I often think that insomnia is the revenge of our emotional difficulties that we've failed to process when we're awake. It's
I
a bit
agree.
out
Yeah,
of
I
my
think
scope.
insomnia is really the way that our waking life is reflected onto our attempts to sleep.
And in so many different ways, we're not saying here for any of the sleep folks out there that insomnia is simply just about anxiety or unprocessed emotional challenges. It's got lots of different facets, but I think that is clearly one of them. So maybe I can take the next question. A sponsor of today's show is Inside Tracker, which is a service that comes out to your home and they will analyze your blood and your DNA to know precisely what is going on inside of you. Hence the name Inside Tracker. They look at your blood, your metabolic signals, your hormonal health metrics, and then they give you a personalized, actionable set of lifestyle changes in response to that readout. And the goal there is to improve your health. I was looking and informed they have some new cardiovascular and new hormonal biomarkers that I'm particularly interested in. One that I'm focused on is something called ApoB, which is an absolutely critical heart health measure. And I get it done now with them somewhere between 4 to 6 times a year. Why? Well, my family unfortunately has a strong history of cardiovascular disease, so I am checking that pretty ruthlessly. And by the way, I do buy the product myself out of pocket. I don't want to fall prey to any of those trappings and undue incentives. Although, with full admission, I still use my own discount code that you can use to get some money off. And that code for you is insidetracker.com/Matt Walker. So just go over to insidetracker.com/Matt Walker. And again, if you want to get that discount, it is insidetracker.com/Matt Walker. Thanks very much.
All right, going from lucidity to sleep hygiene. Our next question is recommendation for improving sleep hygiene.
So, sleep hygiene, the concept, by the way, of course, comes from our teeth. This notion that we should all have some form of dental hygiene in place. Well, there is the recommendation that we all really need to have some form of sleep hygiene in place to protect our night, just as though our dental hygiene protects our teeth during the night and the day. There are, I would say, at least 5 conventional tips that I've spoken about before for optimizing your sleep if you are a healthy sleeper. And I'll come on to those in a second, but maybe you can challenge me, Eti, to come up with some unconventional sleep tips that people may not have heard that I would still say are probably in the ballpark of sleep hygiene, and maybe you can add to them too. But let me start with the conventional sleep hygiene tips. I'm going to explain the underlying tip as well, because people in truth respond to reasons, not rules. So let me give you some of the reasons. The first suggestion I would have comes back to something that we discussed on a previous AMA, which is temperature. Keep it cool. You need to drop your brain and body temperature to get to sleep and stay asleep. If you look at the data, it seems to be around about, for the average adult, it seems to be around about 65, 67 degrees Fahrenheit, or around about 18.4-ish degrees Celsius for most people. That's the ambient temperature that you really want to target. If you look at the studies looking at older adults, there the ambient temperature that is optimal for sleep is a little bit higher. It's somewhere in the high 60s in terms of Fahrenheit. So just keep that in mind. It's fine to have a hot water bottle that you take to bed and put at the end of it and warm your feet or put socks on, but cold the ambient must be. The second I would say is regularity. So if you can just keep things regular, just try to go to bed and wake up at about the same time. Most things, in terms of if you are a healthy sleeper, most things will take care of themselves. Even if you've had a bad night of sleep, just stay regular. Try not to deviate from that. Once you give your brain and your body regularity, they will anchor your sleep rhythms. And the way that that regularity signal will anchor your sleep rhythms is because you have a 24-hour clock inside of your brain, and it regulates your circadian cycle. And when you feed it these delicious signals of regularity, like going to bed and waking up at the same time, as I said, it will anchor your sleep and improve the quantity and the quality of your sleep. The third issue is darkness or light. We are, as I've said many a time, a dark-deprived society in the evening, and you need darkness to instruct your brain and your body to release the hormone called melatonin to help time your sleep. And I think many people have heard of this notion of junk food. Well, I'm going to suggest that there's something called junk light. And the time when light can be junk is at night, and particularly in the last hour before bed. Try to dim down most of the lights or switch most of the lights off in the last at least 30 minutes before bed. I usually do it for the last hour before bed. Everything is dimmed down by at least 60%, or half of the lights are all switched off. And you will be surprised at how that dim light will help you feel sleepy and improve the quality of your sleep.
I have to say, I tried it and I agree completely.
Isn't it striking?
It's just so relaxing. It's almost like listening to rain. It's just something, it's just suddenly you feel sleepiness come over you.
And I think we underestimate how anxiety or how anxiogenic and agitating bright light is at night. And the reason it is, unlike the same light during the day, your brain is not designed to be accepting that intensity of light at that time of day, specifically at that time of night. And it is very aggravating. It's very agitating to our brain. And I would even say, if you need to use your phone or your laptop or your iPad, do one of two things. Really drop down the intensity of the screen in terms of its light, and you can do that very easily. I also have offered the recommendation that Michael Grander, I think, was the originator of. You can do these clever things where you switch your phone to black and white mode, and you will be surprised at not just how calming that is, but also how less engaging your phone becomes when it's black and white. When it's so technicolor, it's very good at capturing your attention and keeping you awake. So light is another tip. The next tip is don't stay in bed awake for long periods of time. Otherwise, you link this thing called your bed with this mental notion of being awake. And you don't want to make the mental connection or memory association, I should say, that when I walk into my bedroom, that's the place where my brain always thinks I'm awake. But if you are lying in bed awake at night, your brain very quickly learns this thing called my bed seems to be the place where I'm awake. And many people will say to me, I don't understand it. I'm falling asleep when I'm watching television on the couch, and then I get into my bed and I'm wide awake, and I can't understand why. And it's because you've bonded the association that Your bed is the place where throughout the night you typically are awake and you stay awake. So if that happens, don't worry. It's just one of those nights. Don't stress. Just get out of bed after about 30 minutes. Go do something like stretching, meditation, listen to a podcast. Don't check your email. Don't eat. That will train your brain to wake up at the same time all the time. And then just go back to sleep when you're sleepy. And there's no time limit for that. And then the other thing I would say is probably be mindful of caffeine and alcohol. We've spoken about that on a previous AMA before and on many other podcast episodes here on this show. Those two things are not going to help you. Everything in moderation. Life is to be lived. I certainly don't want to be the healthiest person in the graveyard, but, just keep things in mind. If you want to improve your sleep, do those things in moderation, and especially think about the timing of those things. If you're going to have to drink, I would always say, tongue in cheek, go to the pub in the morning and the alcohol is out your system later on. And for caffeine, try to get most of it into your system by about 10 or 11, assuming a standard bedtime. So those would be my conventional sleep hygiene tips. Should I come on to some unconventional ideas?
Yes, please.
I think the first one comes from my friend and wonderful sleep scientist, Michael Perlis. I heard him once say this, and it makes total sense. After you've had a bad night of sleep, the best advice is do nothing. And what he meant by that was, after a bad night of sleep, don't stay in bed any later, don't nap during the day, and don't go to bed that subsequent night any earlier. Why? Well, if you sleep in because you had a bad night of sleep, then you're waking up later into the day. And then when you get into bed at your standard time that following evening, you're not going to be as sleepy. Why? Because you just woke up significantly later because you thought that was the wise thing to do after a bad night of sleep, to try and do some catch up. But that then hurts you the following evening because now you're no longer as sleepy as you would be because you've woken up at a later hour and you set yourself up for more failure rather than success. The next is related to this. If you nap during the day, you just take away some of that sleep appetite, some of that sleep pressure. And it's like snacking before your main meal. You take the edge off your sleep hunger, and once again, you're going to suffer another bad night of sleep. And then his suggestion, don't go to bed any earlier just because you had a bad night of sleep. You need to resist that because your circadian rhythm is still expecting to be falling asleep at a standard sleep time. And if you get into bed, let's say you normally go to bed at 11 p.m., but you get into bed at 10 because you think, well, I had a bad night last night, so I'm going to get into bed earlier and try to make up some of that sleep. Not a good idea. Your brain and your body naturally are still not going to be ready for sleep at that earlier time. So once again, you're lying there at 10 o'clock at night and you're wide awake and you just get miserable, frustrated, and anxious because you're not falling asleep. So that's the first tip. After a bad night of sleep, do nothing. A long-standing partner of today's podcast is Element, spelled LMNT. Element is a sugar-free electrolyte drink mix. And for me, it was the sugar-free part of that made me start using it, probably 2 years ago now. And here again, by the way, I do buy my own supply just to stay objective. But beyond having the electrolytes in the right balance for human physiology, the other thing that I'm a fan of regarding Element is that it's scientifically backed. If you look up the people who created the company, you'll find some pretty heavy-hitting physiology, biochemistry, pharmacology knowledge. All of that's baked into the product. And again, it all comes without the downside of any sugar. And now, since I am such a devotee of their product, and P.S., I really do use them each day. I use it for my workout, and then I use it in my protein shakes. I really do, folks. I really do use it. I badgered them, and they have agreed to give you fine folks an 8-count completely free sample pack with any purchase of Element. And to get that, you do have to use the following link, and that is lmnt.com/Matt Walker. So if you would like some free product with your purchase, just go to lmnt.com/Matt Walker, and you can pick up your free swag. The second, I think, again comes onto something we mentioned in an AMA. Have some kind of a wind down routine. Your sleep is not like a light switch. You shouldn't just be able to jump into bed and within 30 seconds fall asleep, nor should you expect that to be the case. Sleep is a gradual physiological process, and my friend Dr. Jeffrey Ellenbogen, who I have to have on the show, he often equates it to a plane. Sleep is much more like landing a plane. It just takes time to come down onto the solid ground territory of this thing called sleep at night. So have some kind of a wind down routine, whether that's meditation, whether it's a warm bath or a shower, light stretching, listen to a podcast, whatever you know works for you to disconnect you from your stress and your anxiety and relax your body. Do that, but don't dash into bed fully wired and expect sleep to arrive, because you're then going to suffer from what we call the tired but wired phenomena. You're going to be lying in bed and you feel sleepy, but you're too wired, so you can't fall asleep. You're wired, and therefore you remain tired. I think the other thing I would mention is naps. If you're struggling with sleep, this comes on to Michael Perlis's suggestion. Try not to nap if you are struggling. That's certainly one of those unconventional tips, because you think, well, I'm not sleeping well at night, then I'll just nap. If you nap, you take away some of that buildup of sleep pressure that you've been doing during the day, and you're not weighed down by as much healthy sleepiness at night because you nap during the day, and your sleep is more shallow, it's more fragmented. Last two things. One study, great study from our colleague here at UC Berkeley, Dr. Alison Harvey. Do not count sheep. She did the study, and what she found was that when people are counting sheep, it takes them longer to fall asleep. What she did find as an alternative was to take a mental walk. So if you're struggling to fall asleep or fall back asleep, close your eyes and think about a walk that you take and that you know really well. So for example, when I used to have a dog, I would take her out on a walk. I could trace that mentally, and you do it in vivid detail. So I walk out the door, I take a left, I go down the steps, and then I look left and right across the street, and then I take a right, I start walking up the hill, and then I do another right bend, and then it's a really steep hill, and already I'm kind of out of breath at the top. It's that level of detail that you need to think about. Why? Because when you take yourself for a mental walk, you are taking your mind off itself. And that is one of the principal problems that people have in falling asleep. They can't get their mind off itself. And that Rolodex of anxiety begins, and you start to ruminate. And when you ruminate, you catastrophize. And at that point, it's going to be very difficult for you to have a good night of sleep. But by taking yourself on a mental walk, you stop your mind worrying about life and all of the stress. And therefore, the next thing that you typically remember, if you look at Alison's data, is hearing their alarm clock go off in the morning, because finally they took their mind off their stresses, and gradually you remove the roadblock to sleep, and they fell asleep.
This is a great tip to add to the anxiety we were discussing before.
Oh, that is I think it's actually a really clever anxiety demodulating effect that we spoke about in a previous AMA. I should have added that. I should have thought about that. Actually, is another study from Alison Harvey. Some people say to me, could you help me understand why I always seem to wake up routinely, consistently at 2:30 in the morning or at 3:45 in the morning? I wake up at the same time every night. And my first question to them is, how do you know it's 2:30 in the morning? And they say, well, because I look at my clock. And I say, well, that's one of the first problems, because when you are struggling with sleep and you wake up and you look at the clock, and then you toss and turn and you look back at the clock, and it was 2:30 and now it's 3:11 and then it's 4:15 in the morning. That is not going to do you any help whatsoever in terms of your sleep. So a final non-conventional sleep hygiene tip: remove all clock faces from the bedroom. You can still have an alarm clock, but remove all signals of time. And when I am traveling and I'm suffering from jet lag, let's say when I go back home, I know that I'm not going to sleep well. And when I wake up, I really don't want to know what time it is, because it's only going to stress me out more. And it's of no use to me. There's no utility in me knowing what time it is. So that's the final thing I would say. Take away all clock faces. And Allison's study demonstrated that the alarm clock is the enemy of good sleep. Scientifically proven. Eti, any final thoughts there? Any additions to unconventional sleep hygiene tips?
That was a great list. Just two things. One is to emphasize the importance of finding ways to deal with stress and anxiety before bed. I think whatever works for you, just latch onto it and practice it every night. And another thing that I don't think many people know, that it's far easier to push sleep to later in the night than it is to try to advance it. So when we're trying to focus on getting enough sleep or getting good quality sleep, the time we should put most effort is when we're getting into bed. Because getting out of bed, biologically and also socially, we have many more constraints that kind of push us out of bed. But getting into bed is just so tricky and so easy to become just this fluid thing that we keep postponing. So, my unconventional tip is to have a little reminder that it's time to go into bed. So, instead of an alarm clock, it's a go to sleep clock. And I hope that will help you over time just get this feeling of this is the time to close everything and retire for the day.
I think that's a great tip. And in fact, sleep scientists now started to come up with a term for this constant, ever forward marching of our sleep time. It is described as sleep procrastination. That we do a little bit of sleep procrastination in the morning when we use a snooze button, but we're procrastinating in terms of waking up. We do a much more dramatic version of it in the opposite direction, going to bed, where we are constantly staying awake past our natural biological tendency and desire and wish to go to sleep. I've been guilty of this before too. I've been thinking, oh, I just remember two thoughts that I want to add to the grand. And I should just very quickly voice dictate them to say, okay, Matt, here's the two thoughts. Do this and remember to do this. But then I think, oh, gosh, actually that wording was, I think, could be effective. Let me just go back and I think, and then I begin reading the rest of the grant and I think, oh, that sentence doesn't sound good. And then I look up at the clock and it's 35 minutes later. Oh no, what did I do? And
I
so,
love how efficient you are, even when you're procrastinating.
no, well, yeah, I
I
suppose.
just watch YouTubes.
No, I'll sometimes do that too. Based on my predilection of cars, I probably watch. I fear that someday someone will expose my YouTube, my personal account, and all they will see for the most part is probably about a 15% pie chart of scientific lectures and stuff that I'm really interested in. And then the remaining 85% is all about cars. And it is my one kryptonite. And I'm desperately embarrassed, but I'm a complete car nerd. Anyway, coming back to it, I think that's a great tip. To bed alarm, I have one of those too. That's the place where you have the greatest opportunity to gain back some sleep. And it's also the place where you have the greatest opportunity to lose sleep in both of those directions. So with that, I will close out this round of our AMA. Eti, thank you again so much for your co-piloting, your brilliance, and your insights. You are always wonderful. The audience, from the comments that I've been receiving, I think there's going to be mutiny at some point from the audience where they say, can Eti just please take over the podcast? And maybe you can come back every now and again as a guest, but thank you again. And for everyone listening out there, thanks for tuning in. we will see tuning in. I always say that. I know this is a podcast. No one tunes to anything. But thank you for downloading. Thank you for listening. If you are enjoying it, please just share the podcast with friends. No need to be reviewing it, or I'm not going to ask for 2, 3, 4, 5-star reviews. Just give me feedback on social media and give us both feedback as to what you're liking about the show. But if you enjoy it, the best thing to do would be share it with folks. Spread the sleep knowledge, be a sleep ambassador. And for now, I will simply say good night, take care, and we will see you in the next episode. Bye for now.